Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I'm coming to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee, here in the United States of America, over YouTube, over my YouTube channel, Anton GF. And today we have an episode that's really special because we're going to be talking, among other things, about Perry Como, and we're going to do so with Matthew Long, who's a vocalist, a music historian, a producer, and the author of a new book on singer Perry Como entitled Magic Moments, The Perry Como Story, which is about to be published here in the United States on February 5th by Bloomsbury Academic. Recently wrote a review of it for Bing Magazine, the journal of the International Club Crosby, and today we got a chance to chat with the author himself, a man who founded the Perry Como Appreciation Society back in 2005, and he joins us from his home in Solihull in the West Midlands in England. Matthew, it's a pleasure to have you, and welcome to the Jazz Flashes podcast.
Thank you very much, Anton. Hello to you and hello to your listeners, and shall I say viewers as well?
Yeah, absolutely. This will be published both as a videocast, if everything goes well, and also, technically, and as also a podcast. So yeah, it's nice to have you here. And Perry Como has always been a favorite singer of mine. This is a podcast called the Jazz Flashes Podcast because, among other things, we talk about jazz. Do you think there's any connection between jazz and Perry Como?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Well, one of his many famous albums, as you may be aware, was "We Get Letters" in 1957. It was Perry's only venture into vocal jazz, but it's a wonderful testament to his ability in the genre. You know, he more commonly exhibited it on television because often in the request spots they'd often do like a small combo number, like to break up the ballads, etc. But he was very capable. His main emphasis was towards ballads and mainstream pop, but he definitely got the chops for it. And in fact, I've just posted on my YouTube channel in the last few days. Are you familiar with Louis Cottrell?
No, I'm not sure I am.
Yeah, well, he was famous in New Orleans for being involved with the Heritage Hall Jazz Band.
Oh,
and there's a wonderful performance of Perry with Louis Cottrell and the band doing "When It's Sleepy Time Down South," and in the middle section they do this wonderful effect of a steamboat with the rhythm, and the way Perry glides across it is superb. I really wish he'd have made more jazz recordings actually, because he'd certainly got the talent for it.
I agree that the way that you talk about Perry and the book that you've recently written about him makes it very clear that you are not only very knowledgeable about him and his music and his life, but also a very big fan. Now, how did that start? When and why were you interested in the music of the man from Cannonsburg, Pennsylvania, Perry Como?
Well, it was about 1999. I can remember that specifically because I used to spend a lot of time in holidays, as in like summer holidays, school holidays, with my grandparents, Emily and Barry, who I've paid tribute to in my book, and we used to do loads of things together, and it was always fun. But in the background, there was always music. There was very often music or great films on the TV. But this one day, my nan was tending to some ironing, and she was listening to a cassette that my granddad had taped. We changed the cassette side over, and I distinctly remember hearing the strings and the brass build up, and then Perry starts singing "It's Impossible." And I was hooked from then, and it's grown from then. And I always had great admiration for his sensitivity with the song. He was able to bring a lot of love and feeling to a song without excessive affectation. He wasn't really. You couldn't say he was a gimmick singer, or he had a particular. He was a hard person, I think, for impersonators to impersonate. because he was a very pure singer. But I started to listen, and it built, and it grew, and I started to go around our charity shops, which I believe you call thrift stores, and picking up records for 50p a pound, and it built from there. And then by the early 2000s, of course, with the advancing internet, I started to link up with people online and speak to some of the record labels, and it's been a labor of love from day one.
Is that how the Perry Como Appreciation Society began in 2005? Tell us a little bit about that project of yours.
Yes, well, I mean, there were at the time, I understand, back at the peak of Perry's career, I think there were maybe 1,000 or 2,000 different fan clubs across the US. We had several popular fan clubs here in the UK, but as of my childhood, there wasn't particularly anything. There was a chap I used to know who was a good friend of mine, Michael Dunnington. He used to have a fan group. He had a fan club and a newsletter, but that came to an end in 2006, I think it was, or 2005. And so I recognised and felt there was a gap. But because I'm a one-man operation, shall we say, it wasn't in the traditional sense of a fan club. It was more of a society to emphasise the revisiting of Perry's recordings. So I've produced and written liner notes for a number of different CD releases, contributed to interviews, etc., and built up a YouTube community and also Facebook to spread the music and keep the conversation going, which I've always felt personally that's what we all need to do for all these wonderful artists. You know, we keep the conversation going and maybe introduce a few new people to the music along the way.
Yeah, and I think that's very important, and I think we need to leave the information about the Appreciation Society in the description box of this video, so that anybody who might be interested might, learn about the existence and maybe get in touch.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I do have an email address for the organisation, which is Perry Como Magic, the 3 words, at outlook.com.
Okay, well, I'll be sure to include that information in the description of the video, and that way, the listenership might be able to contact you about this. Now, being a vocalist yourself, Matthew, how did the music of Perry Como, his style, influence your own style of singing?
Well, I always used to sing at school. I was in the school choir, in a very female-dominated choir, I might add. There was about 18 or 20 of us, and 2 boys, I think. I think there was 2 of us. And but it was good fun. It was good fun. I used to love it. But in those days, the voice was higher, but I was listening to the music and I absorbed it, and naturally I settled into, I guess, a natural baritone / tenor voice range for me. And I always used to sing. I used to sing in the house, in the shower. You might say.
Like Bing Crosby, yes. How he said that everyone thinks that he can sing like he could in the shower.
Yes. Oh, well, that's where I do my best work.
Same here. The only place where I do my best work.
But yeah, I used to sing then, but I'd never sung in public, you say, because I didn't know if I was any good. Quite frankly, I wasn't sure if I got the confidence to do it or the potential. But then one day I decided to put some videos of me singing on YouTube, which was 2011, and I had such a lovely response. I continued, and then I linked up with a friend who's actually in Austin, in Texas, Lamar Pecorino, and we started working together, and he wrote a few songs with me in mind, and we linked up, and that's how it began. I made a few recordings, and then I started singing live in 2013, and it's just built from there.
Mhm. And now, several years later, you have written a book about Perry Como. How did that project come about? And I'm interested in this specifically because it looks like it is an academic publisher that is publishing this book, and it's not so common that academic publishers actually bring out books about, crooners or the Great American Songbook and that kind of thing. So I'd like to know a little bit more about how this project began.
Sure. Well, I was honoured to get to receive support from Bloomsbury Academic. It's wonderful to be having a book published in that manner because it allows it to get across, hopefully, to a wider audience than if you were to self-publish. But the book came about for many years. I did have some involvement in the book that Malcolm and Ken wrote about Perry in 2009, and very kindly, after they completed the book, Malcolm sent me over their data. So they'd been sent data from the University of Colorado in Boulder, pertaining to Perry's shows, but there were inevitably, with such a large career, there were a lot of gaps, etc. So over a period of years, I gradually made my own reference copy of the file and highlighted things in blue whenever I added them, and I ended up with about twice what was previously available through various sources, and I thought I'd love to get this printed. And so I approached a publisher, and they said, well, we couldn't do specifically a reference book like in a database or a record discography, but how would you like to write a biography? And I thought, well, that's an opportunity I can't miss. But incidentally, I hope to be able to put the entire research out at some point, possibly in a self-published manner. But the idea of writing a biography, I thought it would be a wonderful way to consolidate and encapsulate all that I've learned and all the passion of the last 25 plus years.
Well, how did you conduct the research? Because it's not easy to write a biography, and it takes time to do the research. And so, did you encounter any sort of difficulties? How was the process, or what was it like?
Well, thankfully, over the years, very generously, a lot of people have donated material to me, and I've always felt a sense of responsibility to care for these things, look after them, and organise them. So I've probably got a couple, probably maybe 100 or so different magazine articles, various television and radio interviews from through the years, and I was able to. I tried as best as I could to extract Perry's philosophy and stories from himself, because Perry was he was a very private person, and I've always respected that. And because, like what you were saying earlier, you didn't particularly care for some of the works that get rather personal in people's lives, and for me personally, to me that's irrelevant, because it's the music we're talking about. But the passion had always been there within me, and naturally I'd collected lots of records and recordings, and many people, as I'm sure you know, with the Bing Crosby Society, many people had the foresight to record these things on reel-to-reel cassette, and of course acetates earlier from air checks, etc. So I've had, it was an absolute joy for the first over probably a year to gather all this information together and put it, organize it, and then you start to break things out, and you think, oh, that would go nice there, and you think, and you look to different eras, and but all along I've tried to keep Perry's voice in the story, if you like, because sometimes people sometimes when people are trying to write a story, generally like just articles, they have a tendency to kind of either gloss things up or make them melodramatic or whatnot. Well, that wasn't Perry's style, and he really, ultimately, he didn't really have any desire for a book to be written about him. So that's always in my mind. So I guess if I was to say it in a sentence, I'd say I've treated the writing of the book as if I was writing about my own grandfather. And that's the level of respect I feel for Perry. I do feel that strongly about it.
And it comes through as a reader. I can tell that, Matthew. So you really have achieved that with this book. And yeah, before we began recording, I mentioned to you, and this is something very important to me, that when I read a book about a singer or a musician, I'm interested in what the writer has to say about the music. Not so much about the life, or the life in as much as it has any impact in the music. So any books about the scandals of this or that singer, or the private life of this or that actor or director, or soccer player, or whatever it is, I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is the art, and in the case of a singer or a musician, it's even more so. And that's why I admire the work of people like Will Friedwald or Gary Giddens, because they are jazz critics, and they know the music, and they're interested in writing about the music. And I think, Matthew, that as a reader, I can tell that that's what you wanted to do here.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about the music, and trying to get it across to younger generations as well. I mean, I'm 37 myself, so at the time when I first discovered Perry, I was 10. I was 10 years old, so I was very much of a younger generation. But I've always firmly believed that if younger people are exposed to this music, there's a great potential that they'll love it, because I feel like I'm living proof of that. And I know there are other young fans out there now, which is wonderful to see. Younger than myself now. I'm showing my age now, obviously, because now there's a generation in their teens and 20s, which is fantastic. But that's what it's all about: spreading the music, sharing the love.
And I think it is a great idea, because the way that you laid out the book, and I think the people who, starting in February, will be able to buy a copy of this book and read the book, they will see that not only have you worked chronologically as you would when it comes to writing a biography of somebody, but you have also, at the end of each chapter, put together some kind of soundtrack for each one of the chapters. And I think that's a great idea. How did you come up with that idea of giving or listing some of the most important records that Perry Como made in the era that each one of the chapters concentrates upon?
Well, the idea came from the fact that I feel Perry's legacy in recordings has not received its proper due in the public sphere. There have been hundreds of compilations over the years of one form or another, but many of them have never quite captured the full essence, because often they just focus particularly on one particular area, and it's almost inevitably 1945 to the mid 50s. If it steps into the 60s, often that's a real rarity. But there's some great compilations out there, but I don't think they've ever really consolidated them into one area. So I felt by putting them with each chapter, I was able to focus in and hone in on that particular period, and try and give as objectively as possible what I feel are the songs and recordings that best demonstrate Perry's technical ability, but also his ability to convey the words of a song, because I think that often gets missed in compilations. I mean, I suppose it's true with a lot of artists. They keep going for the ones that are perceived as the biggest sellers, but there's so much to choose from with someone like Perry, because he had a 65-year career, well over 40 of those with the same record label, and often the compilations typically cover about 10 years of that entire career. And I think it's important to be able to break things up into different eras, and to be able to give a more rounded view of a particular area, rather than a grab bag of 60 years or such.
I agree. That happens a lot with, Bing Crosby, who is known as the voice of Christmas, and
Yes.
to many people, that's all he ever did. He sang
Hmm.
White Christmas and a bunch of really good Christmas songs that we hear, every year around December, and that's about it. But they don't know about, the Bing Crosby who, was a jazz singer. They don't know about the Bing Crosby who introduced, country music to the pop mainstream. They don't know about the Bing Crosby who was a pioneer of civil rights in many ways. And I feel like this happens with a lot of these artists from the pre-rock and roll era. They're all put in the same bag of being bland, and that their music was not poignant, and it was not, modern or anything like that. But it
Yes.
really was, if you
Oh
look
no.
at it, at the time. And so I would like to talk with you a little bit about Perry Como's career, and get a feel from your perspective of why that career was an important one, not just because of the longevity of the career, but also because of the quality of the music. And Perry Como came out of the big band era, so to speak, a little
Yes.
bit like Frank Sinatra, like Dick Haymes, like some of those singers who were popular around World War II. How important do you think that was for Perry Como?
Oh, very important. I think I would say it was probably his first defining moment, really, as an artist, because his years with the big bands, like so many of his contemporaries, it was crucial because it was the apprenticeship, if you like, of music, because there's no substitute for real experience. And working with a band, you need discipline, and you need to be able to think on your feet, sudden changes, and of course, reading music is a great advantage. Which Perry, he did read music, and he could play a few instruments, particularly the double bell euphonium, as you may recall, reading in the
Yeah.
book. I love that story. I do. I love it. But he was he took the time to build his career because he was always so family centric. His wife and his family always came first because he was a barber first and foremost, and he would have given it all up for them if it had been the choice between the two. And I absolutely love that in an industry where I can imagine a lot of people would choose fame over family. I just think that's brilliant, and I think we need more of that today, because there's a lot more emphasis today on image and the quick success run. Grab the money and run. But Perry he loved what he did, and thankfully, the way things worked out with the transition from the big bands, of course, to the key solo male and female vocalists. He was right there in that time, and he was able to blossom as an artist.
Just as in the case of Sinatra and Crosby, he was not an overnight sensation.
No, that's right. Yeah.
And one thing that I always find interesting is the Jasmine Records label over in England. In fact, put out an album years ago of his recordings with the Ted Weems Orchestra.
Oh, yes.
And he doesn't sound in those early years as polished yet as he would be later, but you can hear a lot of the uh, features of his style already, starting to show. How much importance do you give to those years with Ted Weems in particular?
Well, I think they were very important in terms of his growth. I think by about 1938, I would say he was starting to come into his own, but it was probably about, I'd say conservatively, probably about 1939, 40, when he was into his full rounded tone. Obviously, his voice would continue to develop, but the first couple of years were challenging because, like any young vocalist, he was finding his voice, um, and obviously there was perceptions of similarities to Bing Crosby, for instance. Personally, I actually think he sounds more like Al Jolson in those very early recordings
Hmm.
in the first couple of years. But
Like a softer Al Jolson.
yeah, yeah, there's a kind, yeah, some of the way he holds some of the notes and some of the peaks in the song that kind of feeling of abandon, which is something he completely pulled back over the years. But I mean, it's like myself. When you're starting out, you need some sort of guideline or template, because that gives you the confidence to get out there, because you're not necessarily quite ready to be yourself. You need to, you feel it and you build it over time. I mean, I've been listening to the chronological Crosby set recently. I've decided I'm going to listen to them all through, because I've got the meeting with Jason Lydiard coming up next month.
With the Johnso record series for over 50
right.
of over 50 CDs, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I'm planning to go through all those, plus the ones that Malcolm did for Sepia. So I'm listening through, and it's interesting how long it took. I didn't actually realise how long it took Bing to start to develop into his most recognisable style. It's certainly a good few discs before even the peak of the Paul Whiteman era really presents itself. So it's interesting. You know, we often think of artists by a particular sound from a certain time, or a photograph. You kind of have I always feel like you get an image in your head of someone at a certain point. For me, in Perry, that was him in his early 60s, because the first compilation I had, and one that my grandparents had, was called 40 Graces. It was a K-Tel compilation, and he's on the front cover there, looking as handsome as ever at 63. And that's my base image of him, if you like.
Well,
it's wonderful. But it's very interesting. Just to conclude on that point, it's very interesting how an artist develops, and it happens with everyone. You know, I don't think there's such a thing truly as an overnight sensation. You know, that final opportunity may be very quick, but there's often a lot of groundwork that's gone on first. And I think in the case of the great male and female vocalists of the early to mid 20th century, I think that was a key to their success, because by the time success really came in its biggest form, they were ready for it.
Yeah, well, as you're mentioning, you know, taking a tip from Crosby and from Jolson and from Russ Columbo, and you know, some of those singers from the late 20s, early 30s. Perry Como constructed a style of his own. He wasn't really trying to copy these singers, and I think that's basically what made his career. The fact that he was able to come up with a sound all his own that was recognizable. How would you describe that sound, Matthew?
Absolutely. I would describe it as pitch perfect, a very rounded, deep tone, and the magic ingredient, sincerity in delivery. Not putting any boundary, any border between singer and listener. And he was able to do that, whether he was in the recording studio, on television, or live. And that's a wonderful gift, because I never had the pleasure to know Perry personally, but I feel like I've had such a close connection with his music that I feel like I did know him. And if he happens to be up there somewhere, I hope he doesn't mind what I'm doing, and hopefully I'm on a reasonable track.
In his development, Matthew, how important do you think the medium of radio was? Because for example, for Bing Crosby, it was extremely important. His, you know, Kraft Music Hall series was one of the most popular radio shows of all time, and he was you know, heard by millions and millions and millions of people every week in the 1930s, and that gave him such exposure. And in the case of Perry, I know we associate him more with television, but before that, radio was extremely important as well, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Well, he was on radio regularly by the mid 30s, because Ted Weems and his orchestra were the resident band for the Fibber McGee and Molly comedy series on NBC, and so for a year or so, he had regular. In each show, he had a song performance, and also sometimes a little bit of dialogue with Fibber McGee and Molly. So that was a great starting point. And then, of course, as you may remember later, came the Beat the Band show, which was a real perfect vehicle for the whole band, because rather than it being like announcer and band separate, you've got a situation where the band were brought into it. They'd answer questions that had been sent in by viewers, because the idea of the show, the premise of it, was that listeners sent in a question, and the answer to that question was a song title. And so it could be anyone in the band who answered that. If they got the song, then there was the band was successful, but if they couldn't, they had to forfeit. So the person who rang in got a case of the particular product.
Yeah, it was music / contest, really.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's great, and they really stand up as well, because they're completely, they're harmless, they're inoffensive, but there's a lot of humor in there, because they were hosted by Gary Moore. But but they came to a difficulty in the end, because one of the songwriting disputes, it meant that there was a whole lot of songs they couldn't sing. They couldn't perform ASCAP songs. They could only perform BMI, which was formed about 1941. But then moving on to touch on with that about host versus orchestra, Perry understood that instinctively by the time he got to the Chesterfield Supper Club, because he'd only been hosting it a month or two. And Martin Block was the master of ceremonies, and he kind of thought, well, this is ridiculous. I'm singing the songs, someone else is hosting the show and talking to the guests, and for him, many of the people were friends of his or colleagues. It didn't make sense to him, but it wasn't an ego thing. It was the fact that he felt like he should be having that interaction, for the benefit of the show and the audience, and that transferred beautifully as television presented itself, and that's where that image, that wonderful avuncular, friendly, approachable image started to develop from.
That idea was quite modern, really, at the time, because there was always an announcer, and then the singer could be kind of the host, but not quite, because he would do the banter back and forth with the with the guests, and then sing the songs, but there was always the voice of this really highly trained announcer that was really the one kind of hosting the show. That Bing Crosby began to do away with that in the KMH, but it still lingered. In the case of Perry Como, it was clear that he was not just a great singer, but also a very good host, and I think that's partly what transferred so well to television. And when we talk about television, we definitely need to touch upon that. One thing that I was very surprised about, Matthew, when I read your book, I had heard about this before, and I was aware of this through reading Malcolm and Ken's book, and just the fact that when you study the career of Perry Como, you realize that his presence in the movies was not very big. He wasn't as successful in that medium as he was on radio, records, and television. Do you have an explanation for that?
I think the key reason was that Perry was very much a person for being himself. He never, in whatever he did, he never tried to be anything other than who he was. Another important point that he did cite on quite a number of occasions was that really to get somewhere in the movies, people needed to know you, and they see your body language, your accent, how you present yourself, and they get to know you, and then directors can put you forth for things. But in Perry's case, he was sort of dropped into it with 20th Century Fox in 1944 with the film Something for the Boys, which he had a very small role in. His vocals were standout. There was no concern there, but he was barely on screen, and he hated the process of that, because I think he said he worked 16 weeks on the film, and he said, I think I went through a door once. So he didn't. It didn't work for him, because he felt, I could do that same thing on radio or television in 30 minutes. Or 15 minutes, or later in an hour. because he always loved to work live, even back to the radio days, because they used to do a repeat for the West Coast, because Perry was always based in New York in those days. They did a repeat for the West Coast, which was live. They didn't record it.
Yeah, that was the same thing with Bing's radio shows, and that's one of the reasons why he invested money in tape recording.
Absolutely, yeah. Was it Magnavox? Is it Magnavox?
I think I think it was a German company. It might be. Maybe it's 3M. I can't remember now.
Yeah, and of course that revolutionized recording within
and broadcasting and everything. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the fidelity increase was exceptional. But I think even with those early recordings, there's a lot more potential than there's often envisaged. People often think of a scratchy record, but really a lot of the sound that you hear in 78s is inherent in the format. It's not actually the master discs. And if the master discs exist, and if you've ever heard any press from vinyl, like some of the demos used to be, I mean, it's remarkable, the quality going right back to the 20s and 30s.
Well, going back to him having to repeat the show, though, the TV show.
Yeah. Yes. But back to he always used to do them live. It was only really in the later years he did tape some of the Chesterfield Supper Club shows when he was doing 2 shows a week, which probably made sense time-wise, because if they were rehearsing 2 separate shows, it was an advantage to have one in the can, so to speak, to allow to work on the other one live, But he invited, in those days, he did quite a few of those Chesterfield ones. This is in the 49-50 season from Hollywood. So he had guests like Kirk Douglas and Dorothy Lamour, Eddie Cantor, people like that, which usually, because he was based on the East Coast, I guess it depended on who was around and who was available on that side. So he was very much an East Coast man. And I guess that's another element in his dislike for movie making, because so much of it was in Hollywood.
Yeah, well, in many European countries, regular TV broadcast did not begin until the mid-50s, even late 50s in some cases. In the U.S., it was way earlier than that, and at the very beginning of entertainment on television, Perry Como was there, so he was not only a very important presence for decades, but he was also a television pioneer. Why do you think that? You mentioned that the fact that he always wanted to be real, be in touch with with an audience, and be himself. That lended itself really well for television. But how can we explain the long career and long successful career that Perry Como had on television?
I think it was an instinctive understanding of the format, because when the Chesterfield Supper Club started on television, it was a simulcast. It was quite literally a radio show televised, and but what they did used to do is they used to incorporate a few bits specifically for television. But by the early 50s, Perry was very instinctively building into a particular on-screen persona, and he treated it like he was delivering just to you, rather than millions of people watching at one time. He was addressing you as an individual, and he was bringing the show into homes. So he was thinking of it in a family setting, and I think that matches in with his good taste as well. His sense of taste and what he felt was appropriate for his show, because even retrospectively, looking back 60 or 70 years now, there's very little you could say about a Perry Como program that you could consider controversial. He was very aware of that. Even with guests, he didn't like it. Sometimes if he felt someone had made a bit of a put down comment about a guest on a previous show, he might apologize for it the next week or such. He was he was a really approachable person, and I think that's why people, particularly guests as well, in addition to audiences, that's why guests wanted to be on the show, because they felt they were on the level with him. He wasn't like on a pedestal and them lower. He was always on a level with an audience and with a guest,
Hmm.
because he often in guest duets, for example, it was never a competition.
Hmm.
It was, in fact, if anything, sometimes he might hold himself back to allow his guest to rise above the music, which I think is a wonderful thing to be able to do. And I think it came from the fact, to add to that, that he was very comfortable in his own skin. You know, he was comfortable to be himself, and he never pretended to be anything else.
That's one of the things that when one watches his TV shows, kinescopes of him that have
Yes,
survived, and um, you realize that um, he Perry Como seems to value the guests a great deal in the same way that he values the audience. Like he knows that if the show is going to be successful, it's because there's going to be a connection with the audience, and that connection needs to go through the guests as well. And
absolutely.
and
Yeah.
and even if it's the Perry Como show, and we know that he's the host and he's the star and everything, it's not that he's self-effacing, but he doesn't usually, or at least in the episodes that I've seen, he never comes across as the star and the only star of the show, because he does treat the guests with such a in such a friendly manner that
Yes.
it's just a pleasure to watch. And I think that's part of the secret, so to speak, of his success on television.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I think that would be one of the biggest keys actually, because he was quite happy when appropriate to blend into the background or step to the side. I'm sure that would have helped. Well, I'm convinced that helped with his longevity, because sometimes we see stars today, don't we, on television? We see them on one thing, and then they're on something every day, and they're on all the time, and they're taking all sorts of opportunities. Well, after many years of weekly television, Petty said, well, it's time for a change, time for a break. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, as the saying goes. And I think, that's it might be a cliche, but I think it's very true. Um, he was instinctively aware of that, because they got to a point eventually where it was like he felt they were doing the same show. So that's where he took it back. Because sometimes people, they keep on going at the same pace constantly, and then sometimes people tire of them. So I think less is more, and you could say that sums up Perry.
Yeah, and he kept doing specials though, and that
Oh yeah,
I think was a constant in his later years, that he would do specials, many of which you can actually find on your YouTube channel if if anybody wants to watch some of those. They're really interesting. They're in some ways similar to the Bing Crosby specials that he would do every year. Do you think that he did that for the same reason? The idea of absence makes the heart grow fonder, but I still have to be there once in a while, and like Christmas is a good moment for that.
yeah.
How did he relate to the music of Christmas in particular?
Well, Christmas was a deeply important time of year to Perry, because of what it means, the real meaning of Christmas. First and foremost, it's a family time. The music is beautiful, and it really aligns with his philosophy for life, which ultimately is peace on earth and goodwill to all men and women.
Mhm.
But in terms of the expression, um, that's what it's all about. And I think he was able to, because so many of the songs are so well known as well, it becomes a great community experience. I know that from when I do shows at Christmas myself. I always love Christmas shows, because almost everyone can sing along with at least half a dozen, maybe a dozen of the songs you sing, particularly the carols. I mean, there must be very few people who don't know Silent Night or O Come All Ye Faithful and things like that. And they're the songs that we carry on. It's the tradition. He was a traditional person. He valued tradition, and he was from an Italian upbringing where the door was always open. Christmas they go to midnight mass, come back, like have a fish meal and have or a beautiful dinner of one form, and it was all about the togetherness. And I think just after he left Ted Williams's band, when the band disbanded partly to go in the Merchant Marine, he spent Christmas alone in a Horn and Hardart, which is like one of the traditional food dispensary companies, and he was alone. And he said, "If I live through this, I'm never going to spend Christmas alone again." And he kept his promise. And
That was a very touching moment in your book when you explain that, and really he never did after that.
that's right. Yeah, he always, even right through to the 1990s when he did his final Christmas tours, he used to arrange the tour specifically so he was back in Florida where he lived then for Christmas, and that's wonderful, because what is Christmas without family and that connection? Where it's definitely a time for togetherness.
Absolutely, and Barry Como's uh, peak as a performer, or at least as far as popularity goes, is we could say it's the 1940s and 1950s, and that's why so many of those compilations concentrate on those pre-rock and roll years when he really was extremely popular. Not that he stopped being popular after that, but I wonder how did the advent of rock and roll and then the British invasion with the Beatles and the Stones, Elvis and all of that before. How did that impact his career? Because many of the singers from the previous generation to Elvis or the Beatles found it hard to keep going after rock and roll hit as big as it did.
I think he handled it perfectly, for a singer of his ilk. He was. I think he made a very clever move by adapting to it, and of course he was working with his team at RCA on that. And in fact, RCA's first released rock and roll record was Kokomo, I
Hmm.
Love You So, which was a big hit in 1955. People often would think, oh, the first RCA rock and roll record, Elvis Presley. Well, no,
Hmm.
in fact, it was Perry Como, which goes some way to demonstrate his potential and influence at the time. But in that earlier period, of course, with Bill Haley and the Comets, Rocking
Hmm.
Around the Clock, in those few years before, Perry had a number of successful songs in an up tempo vein, like Papa Loves Mambo, Papaya Mama, Hoop De Doo. They'd all got like an emphasis on the jukebox audience, particularly the teenage 20s audience. And some of the songs, I don't think he was particularly thrilled to record,
Hmm.
but I can certainly say one thing: in no way did he compromise the quality of his performance, because the clarity and enunciation is there. There's a sincerity even when he sings something like Hot Diggity, because the words are in the spirit of love, but there's like an audible wink of humor. He's kind of saying, like, let's have a little bit of fun. He's not pretending. He's just being himself, which is what he always did on television as well. According to Dinah Shaw, for instance, he was a wonderful dancer, but on TV he never danced really.
Hmm.
And if he did, because he felt it was like showing to him, he felt it was like showing off. So he'd always bring those things back. So if he could make a little joke about something, he would do so. And I think that's what helped him with the jukebox market, because it continued to appeal to the people who'd been following him since the 30s and 40s. But it also brought a new generation in at the time, who were, of course, watching him on television. And the two elements together was the perfect formula for a successful record, because it was a little bit like an early version of MTV that was music television, where you have a music video that helps sell the record, and Perry was doing that every week
Hmm.
in the 1950s.
It was also, that time, the early 50s, right before the impact of rock and roll. It was a time of, a certain insecurity in the record business, because nobody
Mm.
knew what was going to sell, or, what pathway the record buying public was going to take, and so it is interesting to see that Perry Como tried to adapt to that, and tried to still make records that had sales potential, but that he thought were still good records. And one of the things that I think you try to debunk in this book is this myth that Perry Como would record just about anything that was thrown in his direction. Apparently,
Oh, absolutely.
after reading your book, I realized that Perry Como was actually a lot more demanding than one might think when it came to choosing the material.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there was a period he said he went through when he just kept saying he'd often say no to a song. He was very cautious about what he recorded, and I think he was always working with a team, and it was important for him to have songs that meant something. I mean, that's what every artist wants. Really, isn't it, to be remembered for certain songs? But I think by linking him with the establishing of his publishing company through Roncom, which was his own company, they published music as well. So there are some instances of songs that Perry didn't record, but they were published as sheet music through his company. So he was a very good, even though he didn't particularly admit it, he was a very good businessman.
Mm-hmm.
But he was never pompous with it. He surrounded himself with people who, in their respective areas, he trusted and he valued the level of what they did. And I think sometimes in the perception of popular singers, even today, there's often an idea that it's purely on one's own merit. And obviously that's really important. Talent is essential, and so is skill. But there's something even more important than that, I think, and that's integrity. And that was really key to Perry. And also surrounding himself with people in their respective areas who knew what they were doing. Because, it takes a team to produce such a result, whether that be in the recording studio or in broadcast media.
Yeah, and in that way, he comes across as a very intelligent man and a person of principles, which, I think is something that he showed throughout his career, at least, when it came to the kind of material he chose, the kind of associations he made in the business with musicians, with, business people, with record labels and that kind of thing. He came from an era that predated the LP, the long playing record, and sometimes some of those singers from that era had a hard time adapting to the new medium. One case would be Dick Haymes, who didn't really record a ton of LPs, starting in the 1950s. It is definitely not the case with Bing Crosby, who made some good albums. It's not the case with Sinatra. How would you describe Perry Como as an LP artist?
I think he was exceptional as an LP artist because once RCA, one of the challenges was in the first instance was the war of the speeds between Columbia Records and RCA, and of course Columbia were known as the inventors of the LP, and they were the ones to first introduce it, and they wanted to work with RCA. But Robert Sarnoff, who was one of the leading people at RCA, he wanted to compete with them rather than work with them, which meant the emphasis on bringing a new format to replace the 78, which of course was the 45. So in the early years, for the first 4 or 5 years, really RCA were really plugging the 45. So, which probably to a certain degree limited earlier albums, even though there are some small albums. But by the time you get to the mid-1950s, I think it was probably pretty universally accepted that the LP was the format for album recordings, as opposed to like a smart set or a box of records. And Perry was highly successful in it because the album format is a unique opportunity to expand on a particular theme.
Mm-hmm.
And by working with such wonderful talents as people like Mitchell Ayres and later Nick Perito, they produced, I would say, at least a dozen and a half essential albums, at least, over the following 20, 25, 30 years.
Would you say that Perry Como was interested in making concept albums in the way that Frank Sinatra did, or was that not a particular interest that he had?
Yes, I would say so. I wouldn't say it was necessarily in the same way as Frank Sinatra, but then Perry wasn't trying to emulate Frank Sinatra. There was a difference to the concept in Perry's albums, in the fact that usually there was an emphasis on variety. For example, he didn't do like an album entirely of torch songs, although he did sing them, like in his album So Smooth, which was an early concept. His first concept album effectively was We Get Letters, which is with the jazz combo, and that provides on a particular theme. But there was certain signatures, I would say, in Perry's albums. There's certain signatures that were recurrent. One of them was usually a song of faith. Most of his albums, at some point, have a song of faith or inspiration. At some point, whether that be an up-tempo song or a ballad, and then between that, there was a mixture of tempos and feels. So I think perhaps it may have been in an RCA context that they were always considering songs as a potential link in with the singles market as well, which of course you're kind of touching two areas really, because in a way there was a difference between the buying public of singles and albums. So I think it was a very clever thing to do. That's certainly what he did when he got to Nashville, for example. They would typically, certainly in the late 60s, early 70s, they'd often put out a single early and see how it responded. And then based on that success, they would shape the album around that concept.
That was very typical of RCA, now that you mention that, because they did the same thing with Elvis Presley, and sometimes they packaged his albums in a very poor manner. In the case of Elvis, not so much in the case of Perry. But one thing that I do appreciate about Perry is how eclectic he could be. It doesn't really, you don't have that feeling if you listen to his big hits, the ballads from the 40s, from the early 50s. But in the 1960s, he tried his hand at bossa nova, just like Sinatra and many others did. And actually, that was a style that, in my opinion, really suited his voice.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that's a great skill. I always think that's one of the benchmarks of a really great singer. It's their ability to translate their style to other genres without actually abandoning their core style. So, as in, they're still completely recognizable. And as you rightly say, the Latin genre was a perfect fit for him because of those gentle, sometimes double time rhythms. And of course, with an arranger like Nick Perito, it was hand in glove for him as well.
To me, I think it's a case of a singer who really understands what material is good for him, because he did not eschew any type of song. He could sing a Don McLean song, he could sing a Brazilian song, and he could sometimes, dust off an old, Tin Pan Alley song that was forgotten since the 1920s. And I think that's something he did on radio, that's something he did on records as well. And to me, that kind of adds to the appeal of his music as a recording artist and as a maker of long-playing records.
Well, definitely, because I think that's one of the keys and secrets, I think, to his longevity. It's a willingness to evolve. Because I think you do evolve as an artist. I don't think any artist is the same as they were at the start of the career as they are in the middle or towards the end. I think you've got to be in tune with the time, certainly if you want to be financially successful. And being financially successful is important, especially if you're with a major label, because as unfortunately happened in the mid-50s with the advent of rock and roll, there were quite a lot of artists that they more or less faded into oblivion. Thankfully, many of them have been revisited since, but it was almost as if they'd not been there at all. So I think keeping ahead of the curve, so to speak, is very important. I remember Nick Perito saying that one of his brothers advised him when he was learning to play an instrument. He said, make sure you can learn to play, make sure you can learn to read music, because if you can't read music, there'll be 10 guys waiting behind you who can. So that, reading was a big advantage, and it was the same for Perry, because it meant that if people wanted to promote their songs recorded by other artists, he could look over the written arrangement in a few minutes, and he could strike up with the band, and they could have a run through, and they could be performing. He performed hundreds and hundreds of songs that he never recorded on television, and I think his musical theoretical ability really served him well there, in a way that a non-reader would probably have struggled with the demand of like in the early days. In the case of being on 3 times a week, that's potentially that's 3 times 3, 9. That's potentially 9 different songs he could be singing, and most of them potentially might not even have been ones he recorded himself. So there's a certain discipline and a skill required there to keep that up, and he was doing that in the early 50s over 100 times a year. Over 100 shows a year.
And I think your book, Magic Moments, the Perry Como Story, will help revisit and reevaluate the music and the career and the figure of Perry Como. And as we're winding down the conversation, Matthew, I was wondering if there are any particular albums that you like, especially that you would recommend in particular, not just one, because it would be impossible for me to just choose one album by Perry Como or Sinatra or Bing Crosby. But are there any albums in particular that you kind of come back to, regularly, that are, especially appealing to you?
Well, I've got 2 answers to that question usually. The one is all of them.
Well, I will not take that one. You'll have to elaborate a little more.
The second answer is it's impossible, as a bit of a play on words, and that was an album title. But I think the best way I can answer it is I could give you a couple of responses on either side. So I'll say a couple that I always seem to be returning to myself to sing along to. One of those is Just Out of Reach from 1975. I often return to that to sing along to myself in the car. But if I was looking objectively in what I think represents Perry at his finest, if you love ballads, pick up a copy of By Request or Look to Your Heart. They're wonderful albums, beautiful. If you're more of a swing or jazz person, Como Swings will fit the bill beautifully, or We Get Letters. But there are so many others that you could choose from as well. But if I was to, I really honestly, hand on heart, don't think I could actually choose a personal favourite. I think, again, touching on what we were just saying about Perry's approach to albums, there was such an amount of variety. It's a bit like trying to compare, how shall I say, to compare a pizza with a beef bourguignon or something. It's so different that it's in a different. It's in a different category. So I think it would be unfair to do that. Just treat yourself to a studio album, and I don't think you'll go far wrong.
And that's why I wanted to hear about a slew of albums from you, not just one, because I know that's really impossible. The Songs I Love, I think it's called, is one of my favorites from the 1960s. The one where he has the bossa nova beat in there, and I just wish I think that's the one that's called The Songs I Love. I can't remember now if that's the title, but
he sings a couple of Latin songs in that, slightly out of tune, Desafinado and Carnival.
Yeah,
which he does wonderfully in the way he would do on television, because he's worked with Hugo and Luigi, as you may be familiar with.
mhm.
They did 5 albums together in the early '60s, and that was a big change for him as well. But it worked so well because they
Yeah.
were famous for working with Sam Cooke and Elvis Presley and many others. So it's clever, careful, thoughtful planning of things, and not rushing, never rushing.
Well, if you are interested in learning more about Perry Como, finally, I will just recommend once again that book that's about to be published in February here in the United States, Magic Moments, the Perry Como story, written by Matthew Long, who has been our guest today, and it's published by Bloomsbury Academic. And the nice thing about the book is not only how well it's written and how wonderful of an introduction it is to the music and to the figure, to the career of Perry Como, but also the soundtrack that it provides with all those different records and radio appearances and all different kinds of recordings that Perry Como made in his 60-plus year career, which is absolutely fantastic. My final question, Matthew, is if you had to describe the place that Perry Como has in 20th century music, especially pop music, what would you say? What would that be?
It's a very good question. It's quite a deep question as well.
And that's why I leave it for the end.
Yeah, leave them on a thought-provoking moment, and then of course they can respond in the comments as well with their thoughts as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I would say, in terms of his importance, I think he was one of the most important 20th century entertainers, and I don't just say that as a great admirer of his. You can look at the facts, look at the statistics, look at the longevity of his career, and the sheer sincerity. Everything he did was with sincerity. He was always on the level with a person, and I think that was absolutely key to his success, paired with an understanding and appreciation of excellence in what he did. And I love him for it, and I'll always love him. And as I said earlier, if he's listening somewhere, I hope he likes what I'm doing, because I love him.
Well, we love him too, and we appreciate, Matthew, your being here with us today on the Jazz Flashes podcast, talking about your love for Perry Como and also about your book, Magic Moments, the Perry Como story, that's about to be published. It has been an absolute pleasure, Matthew. I wish you all the best in anything that you do in your life, personally and professionally, in the next several years. And whenever you have anything new to share, well, come back to the podcast and let us know about it.
Well, thank you very much, Anton. It's been an honor and it's been a pleasure. And you know what you're doing.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast, recorded as a conversation between Jackson, Tennessee, and Solihull in England. Our guest today, Matthew Long, author of the Perry Como story, Magic Moments, soon to be published by Bloomsbury Academic. Pick up a copy and also check out all the information in the description box of this video, and you'll learn a lot more about Perry Como and also about our guest, Matthew Long. If you have any comments, leave them underneath the video, and of course, we will do our best to respond. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, signing off now from Jackson, Tennessee, here in the United States of America. This has been a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. Thank you, Matthew. Take good care.
Bye.